"It's you," the old woman wheezed, her grip like a vice on the waitress's arm. Eyes wild. "Jennifer, you've come back." Jessica, that's the waitress, just wanted to finish her shift. But this lady's stare, it cut deep. Crazy, sure, but something felt off. The woman's son, face like granite, just apologized, mumbled about confusion. But get this, he never saw the glint of silver beneath Jessica's uniform, the heart-shaped locket she'd carried since they pulled her, a baby from a fire. He doesn't know it holds their family. He thinks she's after something. He has no idea how her quiet kindness will change everything. The locket tells a story, a hidden one. But for whose sake? Before Jessica could respond, the woman's eyes rolled back. Her body went slack, collapsing against the vinyl booth with a soft thud that silenced the entire diner. In that single heart-topping moment, a simple case of mistaken identity spiraled into a decade-old mystery. That would shatter one life and remake another. The scent of stale coffee and sizzling bacon was the perfume of Jessica Morgan's life. It clung to her hair, her cheap apron, and the worn-out dreams she kept tucked away like forgotten order slips. At 24, her world was the 15 ft stretch of linoleum behind the counter of the Greasy Spoon. A diner that was as tired and unassuming as she often felt. Her days were a metronome of clattering plates, bubbling coffee pots, and the low murmur of conversations she was paid to overhear but never join. She was good at her job, efficient, polite, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes but was convincing enough for a decent tip. Customers were a blur of faces. Truckers nursing their fifth coffee students, cramming for exams over sticky syrup-laden plates, and the elderly who came for the cheap early bird specials and a flicker of human connection. That Tuesday started like any other. The lunchtime rush was a controlled chaos of shouted orders and the rhythmic clang of the cook's spatula against the griddle. Jessica moved through it all with the practiced grace of a dancer, balancing plates on her arm, refilling coffee cups without breaking stride, and mentally calculating tabs. Around 1:30 p.m., as the wave of customers began to recede, they walked in, an elderly woman, frail and leaning heavily on the arm of a man in his late 50s. The man, Walter Peterson, had a face etched with a permanent sort of weary resignation. His suit was well made, but rumpled as if he'd been wearing his worries for too long. His mother, Brenda, looked as delicate as a dried flower. Her gaze was distant, sweeping across the diner, without seeming to register any of it until it landed on Jessica, and stopped. Jessica was wiping down a nearby table, her back to them, but she felt the stare. It was a physical sensation, like the heat from an oven door left ajar. Prickles ran up the back of her neck. She turned slowly, a polite, "Be right with you," already forming on her lips. The words died in her throat. The old woman was staring at her with an intensity that was unnerving. It wasn't the simple gaze of a customer waiting for a menu. This was something else entirely. It was a look of raw, incredulous discovery, as if Jessica were a ghost who had just materialized from thin air. The woman's lips parted, but no sound came out. Walter gently guided his mother into a booth. "Mom, come on, sit down." He urged, his voice low and strained. He gave Jessica an apologetic glance, a small, tired shake of his head that seemed to say, "Just ignore her." Jessica, professional as ever, grabbed 2 menus and a couple of glasses of water. She approached the booth, her practiced smile firmly in place. "Hi, folks. What can I get for you today?" Walter started to order, his tone brisk and businesslike, but Brenda wasn't listening. Her watery blue eyes, magnified by thick lens glasses, traced every feature of Jessica's face, from her long, dark brown hair tied back in a simple ponytail to the sprinkle of freckles across her nose. But mostly she stared at her eyes, a deep hazel green that tended to shift with the light. "You have his eyes," Brenda whispered, her voice a ready tremor. It was so quiet Jessica almost missed it over the diner's ambient noise. Jessica faltered. "I'm sorry, Mom. My husband," the old woman clarified, her gaze unwavering. "Robert." He had those same eyes, green like the woods after it rains. She reached a trembling hand across the table, her fingers barely brushing the sleeve of Jessica's uniform. "It's you." Walter sighed a deep, rattling sound of utter exhaustion. Mom, please don't do this. She's just a waitress. He looked at Jessica, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and warning. I'm very sorry. My mother, she gets confused sometimes. Jessica offered a small, understanding smile. It wasn't the first time an elderly customer had been a little disoriented. It's no problem at all, she said softly, trying to direct her attention back to Walter. Did you say you wanted the turkey club? But Brenda was not to be deterred. Her grip, surprisingly strong, tightened on Jessica's arm. No, you don't understand, she insisted, her voice gaining a desperate strength. Jennifer, my sweet girl, you've come back. The name hung in the air, heavy and strange. Jennifer. Jessica's smile finally vanished. A chill, cold and sharp, snaked down her spine. I think you have me mistaken for someone else. My name is Jessica. No, Brenda said, shaking her head, her eyes filling with tears. They told me you were gone. 10 years. 10 long years. But I knew a grandmother always knows. She tried to pull herself up from the booth, her face owl-light with a heartbreaking, impossible hope. We have to go home. Your father, Walter. Look, it's Jenny. Walter buried his face in his hands. For God's sake, Mother, stop it. You're making a scene. The commotion was starting to draw glances from the few remaining customers. Jessica felt her cheeks flush with heat. She tried to gently pull her arm away, but the old woman clung to her. Ma'am, please, Jessica said, her voice firmer now. You need to let go. It was then that Brenda's face changed. The ecstatic joy dissolved, replaced by a look of sudden sheer panic. Her breath hitched. Her eyes still locked on Jessica widened in terror. She gasped a wet, rattling sound. Her hand flew to her chest, clutching at the fabric of her blouse. Jenny. She breathed the name, a final desperate plea, and then she collapsed. Her body went slack, sliding sideways in the booth. Her head hit the vinyl with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the now silent diner. A glass of water tipped over, shattering on the floor. For a frozen second, nobody moved. Then chaos erupted. Mom! Walter screamed, lunging across the table. Oh my God, Mom! Mr. Henderson, the diner's owner, rushed out from the kitchen. What happened? Somebody called 911. Jessica stood rooted to the spot, her arm still tingling where the old woman had grabbed it. The name Jennifer ricocheted in her mind. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic trapped bird. She stared at the pale, still face of the woman in the booth, a complete stranger who had looked at her and seen a ghost. A stranger who had collapsed at her feet. A cold, creeping sense of dread washed over her, the chilling premonition that this was not just a random, tragic event. This was the beginning of something, and somehow, inexplicably, it had everything to do with her. The wail of the ambulance siren faded into the city's drone, but the sound remained lodged in Jessica's ears. Mr. Henderson had sent her home, telling her she looked as pale as a ghost. He wasn't wrong. She felt like one insubstantial adrift, haunted by the image of Brenda Peterson's slack face and the echo of a name that wasn't hers. Jennifer. She couldn't shake it. Back in her small, cramped apartment above a laundromat, she paced the worn floorboards. Why had she been so affected? It was a sad, confused old woman. That's all, but it felt like more. It felt like a stone had been dropped into the still, murky pond of her own life, and she was terrified of the ripples. Jessica's past was a book with the first few chapters torn out. She'd grown up in the foster care system, passed from one temporary home to another. Her earliest memories were hazy, fragmented images that felt more like dreams than reality. The smell of smoke, the color red, a woman soft singing. Her social workers had told her she was found after a fire, a toddler with no identification and no family to claim her. They gave her a name, Jessica Morgan, and a birthday. They estimated she was a blank slate, a story starting on page 20. She'd learned early on not to ask too many questions. The answers were always the same. We don't know, or it's better to look forward, not back. Driven by an impulse she didn't understand, she found the business card for the hospital the paramedics had given Walter. She had no reason to go. She was a stranger, the accidental catalyst for a medical emergency. Yet she felt an undeniable pull, a need for something, closure, an explanation. An hour later, she was walking through the sterile, antiseptic-smelling corridors of St. Michael's Hospital. She found the waiting room for the cardiac care unit and saw him immediately. Walter Peterson was slumped in a chair, his head in his hands, the picture of defeated grief. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorframe. What was she even doing here? This was a private family matter. As if sensing her presence, Walter looked up. His eyes, red-rimmed and exhausted, narrowed when he saw her. He stood up, his body language radiating pure hostility. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice a low, angry growl. He strode over, blocking her path. "Haven't you done enough? My mother had a massive heart attack. The doctors, they don't know if she's going to make it. All because you had to stand there and let her work herself into a state." The accusation struck Jessica like a physical blow. "I didn't do anything," she stammered. "I just came to see if she was okay." "I was worried." "Worried?" Walter scoffed, a bitter, humorless sound. "Save it. People like you see a confused old woman. You see an opportunity. I don't know what you were after, but you're not getting it." "An opportunity? What are you talking about?" "I was just doing my job." Jessica's fear was quickly being replaced by anger. "Your mother grabbed me. She called me a name. I'm sorry she's sick. I truly am. But you can't blame me for that." Her defiance seemed to puncture his rage, leaving behind the raw grief it was protecting. He deflated, rubbing his temples with a trembling hand. "You don't understand," he said, his voice cracking. "For 10 years she's done this. Sees a girl with the right hair color, the right height, and for a moment she thinks she hopes." He sank back into his chair. "But it's never been like this. She's never been so certain, never collapsed." He looked up at Jessica, and for the first time she saw past the anger to the profound, bottomless pain in his eyes. "My daughter Jennifer, she disappeared 10 years ago. She would be your age now." 24. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. "What? What happened to her?" Walter stared at a fixed point on the scuffed linoleum floor, his mind clearly a decade in the past. "We had a fight, a stupid, terrible fight about a boy, about her future. She was headstrong, just like her mother. She stormed out. We thought she'd be back in a few hours after she cooled off. But she never came back." He swallowed hard. "We filed a missing persons report, hired investigators, searched for years. Nothing, not a trace. It was like she vanished off the face of the earth." The story settled in the sterile air between them, thick with tragedy. Jessica felt a pang of sympathy, so sharp it was almost painful. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Walter seemed not to hear her. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn, creased photograph, the edges soft with time. He held it out to her. "This is her," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "This is my Jenny." Jessica took the photo with a hesitant hand. The girl in the picture was smiling, a swoot, uninhibited grin. She was about 14 with long dark brown hair and a spray of freckles across her nose. But it was her eyes that made Jessica's heart stop. They were a deep hazel green, shifting with the light just like her own. Staring at the photograph was like looking at a younger, happier version of herself. The resemblance was more than just passing. It was staggering. It was like looking at a sister she never knew she had. "You see," Walter's voice was barely a whisper. "The resemblance is uncanny. It's why my mother reacted the way she did." He quickly took the photo back, as if regretting showing it to her. "But it's just a coincidence. A cruel cosmic joke." Jessica couldn't speak. Her mind was reeling. A coincidence. It felt too profound, too specific. An old memory, hazy and indistinct, surfaced, a flash of a different bedroom, a different face in the mirror. She shook her head, trying to clear it. It was just suggestion, her mind playing tricks on her. "There was one thing," Walter continued, his voice hardening again as he tucked the photo away, rebuilding his wall of disbelief. "My daughter had a scar, a very distinctive one, a small crescent-shaped scar on the inside of her left wrist from a climbing accident when she was 12. So you see, He finished his tone, leaving no room for argument. You can't be her. His words were meant to be a final, definitive dismissal, a full stop to his mother's fantasy and Jessica's involvement. But they had the opposite effect. Instinctively, automatically, Jessica's eyes shot down to her own left wrist. There, pale against her skin, was a small, silvery mark she'd had for as long as she could remember. A thin, perfectly formed crescent moon. The social workers had told her it was likely from the fire, a burn scar. She'd never had any reason to question it until now. Her blood ran cold. She felt the world tilt on its axis, just as it had in the diner. Slowly, as if in a trance, she pushed up the sleeve of her thin cardigan, revealing the mark. Walter's eyes followed her movement. He saw the scar, his face already pale with exhaustion and grief turned ashen. The confident dismissal in his eyes flickered and died, replaced by something new. A flicker of utter terrified and impossible shock. The air crackled with the unspoken question that now hung between them, a question so monumental it threatened to consume them both. The drive home from the hospital was a blur. Jessica's hands were slick on the steering wheel, her mind a maelstrom of confusion and a terrifying, burgeoning hope that felt like a betrayal of her entire life. Walter hadn't said another word after seeing the scar. He had simply stared, his mouth slightly agape, before a nurse had called him away to speak with the doctor about his mother's condition. He'd left Jessica standing in the corridor, her own wrist feeling like it had been branded a coincidence. That's what he'd called it. But this, the face, the eyes, and now the scar. Coincidences didn't stack up like that. They were single random events, not a constellation of impossibilities pointing to a single unbelievable truth. Back in her apartment, the silence was deafening. The familiar space felt alien, the peeling paint and mismatched furniture seeming to belong to a stranger named Jessica Morgan. But who was she really? Was that name just a label stuck on her by a system that hadn't known what else to do? Her entire identity was built on a foundation of, we don't know. Now a crack had appeared in that foundation, and she felt herself slipping through. The fragmented memories she had long suppressed began to surface with a new insistent clarity. The smell of smoke wasn't just a dream, it was acrid choking. The color red wasn't just a color, it was the terrifying dancing flicker of flames. And the woman singing. It was a lullaby, a soft, loving voice that felt like home. A frantic energy seized her. She needed proof, something tangible from her own nebulous past. In the back of her closet, buried under old blankets and art supplies she hadn't touched in years, was a small cardboard box. It was her entire history handed to her when she aged out of the foster system at 18. It contained a handful of school report cards, a few faded photos of her with various foster families, and her birth certificate, a document she now knew might be a work of fiction. She tore the box open, her hands shaking as she sifted through the meager artifacts of her life. And then she found it tucked at the very bottom, something she hadn't looked at in years. A small sealed manila envelope labeled Personal Effects J. Morgan. Inside were the items she'd supposedly been found with as a child. Her breath hitched. There were only two things. The first was a small tattered piece of a wool blanket, smoke-stained and smelling faintly of age. The second was a tarnished silver locket shaped like a heart. It was dented on one side and blackened with time. She'd tried to open it once as a teenager, but found it was stuck, the clasp seemingly fused shut. She had dismissed it as a worthless trinket. Now she looked at it with new eyes. This was from before. Before Jessica Morgan. With trembling fingers, she worked at the clasp, her nails scraping against the old metal. It wouldn't budge. Frustrated, she grabbed a small pair of pliers from her toolkit. With a delicate twist and a prying motion, there was a faint click. The locket sprang open. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Inside were two tiny circular photographs, protected under yellowed plastic. On the left was a smiling man with kind hazel green eyes. Walter had said her grandfather's name was Robert. It had to be him. On the right was a young woman with long, dark hair holding a baby. The woman was laughing, her head thrown back in joy. Jessica didn't recognize the woman, but she knew with a bone-deep certainty that the baby in her arms was her. Tears streamed down her face, hot and fast. This was it. This was real. This locket was a message from a life she couldn't remember. But it wasn't enough. Walter would call it another coincidence. She needed more. She needed to know how a girl named Jennifer Peterson, with a family and a home, became an amnesiac Jane Doe in the foster system. Her next thought was of her last social worker, Mrs. Gable, a stern-by-the-book woman who had always seemed uncomfortable when Jessica asked questions about her past. She had always steered the conversation away, insisting that focusing on the here and now was what was best for her. At the time, Jessica had assumed it was just bureaucratic indifference. Now it felt like evasion. She found her old case file number and dialed the county's social services department. After being put on hold for what felt like an eternity, a bored-sounding receptionist informed her that Carol Gable had retired 3 years ago. They couldn't give out her personal information. It was a dead end. Jessica hung up, a wave of despair washing over her. She was so close yet so far. She looked at the locket in her palm, the tiny faces staring up at her. They were her family, a grandmother who was lying in a hospital bed because she had recognized her. A father, could she even think of him that way, who was so wounded by the past he couldn't see the present? A new resolve hardened within her. She would not let this go. Walter may have built a wall of denial, but she had a sledgehammer. She had the scar, and now she had the locket. She picked up her phone again, her fingers hovering over her contacts. There was one other person she could call a lifeline to her past, however tenuous. A woman from one of her last foster homes, a kind soul named Miss Davis, who had always encouraged her to draw and had shown her more genuine affection than anyone else. They exchanged Christmas cards but hadn't spoken in over a year. Taking a deep breath, Jessica dialed the number. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was older, but still warm and familiar. "Mrs. Davis, it's Jessica. Jessica Morgan." "Jessica, dear, how wonderful to hear from you. How are you keeping?" The simple kindness in her voice made Jessica's throat tighten. I'm okay. Actually, something has happened. Something strange. I need to ask you about my file, about when I first came to you. Did Mrs. Gable ever say anything specific about the fire? About where I was found?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Mrs. Davis spoke again, her voice was more hesitant. "Well, it was all very hush-hush, dear. Carol, Mrs. Gable, she was very strict about the details. She said it was for your own protection to prevent any trauma from resurfacing." Another pause. "But there was something odd. Your file was unusually thin for a Jane Doe case. Almost empty. Just the basics. And I always thought it was strange that there was no public appeal, no media coverage trying to identify the lost little girl from the fire. That's usually the first thing they do." The words hit Jessica with the force of a physical blow. No public appeal. Why would they not try to find her family? Unless someone didn't want her family to be found, unless someone knew exactly who she was, and for some reason created a new identity for her instead. The image of Mrs. Gable's stern, unyielding face flashed in her mind. It wasn't indifference Jessica had seen in her eyes all those years ago. It was fear. Walter Peterson sat in the dim light of his study, the smell of old books and bourbon heavy in the air. His mother, Brenda, was stable but unconscious, hooked up to a symphony of beeping machines in the CCU. The doctors used cautious words like prognosis and observation, but Walter knew what they meant. She was balanced on a knife's edge, and a waitress with his daughter's eyes had pushed her there. Or had she? He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice clinking a lonely rhythm. He had built a fortress around his heart over the past decade, its walls made of cold, hard facts. Jenny was gone. Hope was a poison. Grieving was a private, orderly process. He had a life to manage, a business to run, an aging mother to care for. There was no room for ghosts. Then Jessica Morgan had walked up to their booth. He'd seen the resemblance. Of course, he wasn't blind. It was a shock, a cruel twist of the knife. But he had dismissed it. He was practiced at dismissing things that hurt too much. But the scar, he couldn't dismiss the scar. He had described it so clearly, so definitively, as the one thing that would prove she wasn't Jenny. A secret password only the real Jenny would know. And then she had pushed up her sleeve, and there it was, a pale, perfect crescent moon. The fortress wall hadn't just been breached. It had been vaporized. For the first time in 10 years, a sliver of terrifying, unwelcome hope pierced his carefully constructed defenses. It was agony. To hope now, after all this time, felt like a betrayal of his grief, a path that could only lead to an even more devastating heartbreak. But what if? The question was a torment. He couldn't live with it. He needed to know one way or another. He needed to either prove this waitress was an astonishing fraud or confront the impossible. There was only one person he could call. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts to a name he hadn't dialed in years. Robert Finch. Finch had been the private investigator they'd hired after the police had exhausted their leads. He was a former cop, old school relentless, and a bloodhound for the truth. He had poured years of his life into finding Jenny, turning over every stone, chasing every dead-end lead until even he had to admit the trail was ice cold. The failure had haunted Finch. Walter knew it was the one case he never closed. The phone rang 4 times before a gruff, growly voice answered. "Finch, Robert, it's Walter Peterson." There was a moment of silence on the other end. Walter Finch said, his voice softening slightly. "It's been a long time. I hope you're calling with good news, but I have a feeling you're not." "It's my mother," Walter said, his voice strained. "She had a heart attack today." "I'm sorry to hear that. Brenda's a tough woman, is she?" "She's hanging on, but that's not why I'm calling." "Robert, something's happened. Something I can't explain. I need you to look into someone for me, off the books, quietly." Walter explained everything. The waitress, the staggering resemblance, his mother's collapse, and finally his voice dropping to a near whisper. The scar. Finch listened without interruption. When Walter finished, the line was silent for a long moment. Walter could picture him in his cluttered office, stroking his graying beard, the gears of his sharp analytical mind beginning to turn. A crescent-shaped scar on her left wrist. Finch finally repeated the words, methodical and measured. "You're sure?" "I saw it with my own eyes," Walter confirmed. "And her name is Jessica Morgan, works at the Greasy Spoon downtown." "Yes." "All right, Walter," Finch said, a new energy in his voice. "I'm semi-retired, you know. Spend most of my days fishing. But for Jenny, I'll dust off the old files. Give me 48 hours. True to his word, Finch went to work. He didn't approach Jessica directly. That would be too clumsy, too obvious. He started with the periphery. He ran a background check on Jessica Morgan. The results were exactly what one would expect for a ward of the state. Born an orphan, no known relatives, a string of foster homes in the Tri-County area. Her social security number was issued when she was 5 years old. Before that, she didn't officially exist. Next, Finch drove to the Greasy Spoon during a quiet afternoon when he knew Jessica wouldn't be working. He sat at the counter, ordered a black coffee, and struck up a conversation with the owner, Mr. Henderson, posing as a long-lost uncle, trying to reconnect with his niece. He learned that Jessica was a good kid. Quiet, kept to herself, a talented artist who sometimes sketched customers on napkins when she thought no one was looking. Reliable, hard-working, and utterly alone in the world. There was no hint of deception, no whiff of a con artist. The most crucial part of his investigation, however, took place in his dusty garage, surrounded by boxes of cold cases. He found the one labeled Peterson J. Inside was a decade of heartbreak documented in files, photographs, and interview transcripts. He spread the contents across a large table, the ghost of a smiling 14-year-old girl staring up at him. He reread the timeline of her disappearance, the argument with her parents, the last time she was seen walking away from her house. He reviewed the interviews with her friends. They all said the same thing. Jenny was upset, but she was a homebody. She loved her family. She would never just run away and not come back. He focused on the first 72 hours, the most critical period. Police had checked bus stations. Train stations put out an alert. Nothing. It was as if she had simply been erased, but Finch was looking for something new now. Armed with the knowledge of Jessica's past, he pulled out a map of the state and marked the location of the Petersonen home. Then he began to research fires that had occurred in the region around the same time Jenny vanished. It took hours of cross-referencing old news articles and public records. Then he found it. A small article buried on page 6 of a local paper from a town 50 miles away, dated 3 days after Jenny's disappearance. Fire destroys abandoned warehouse housing transients. One unidentified child survivor. The article was brief. A fire had swept through a derelict building on the outskirts of the town of Northwood. Most of the squatters had escaped, but firefighters had pulled a young girl estimated to be around 4 or 5 years old from the smoke-filled building. She was suffering from smoke inhalation and severe disorientation. No one at the scene knew who she was, and the girl herself was unable to speak. She was taken to Northwood General Hospital and placed in the care of county social services. Finch felt a jolt, the familiar thrill of a lead. Northwood was in the same county where Jessica Morgan's official record began. The age was wrong. Jenny was 14, but in the chaos of a fire with a traumatized, smoke-covered victim, could a terrible mistake have been made? A 14-year-old small for her age and in shock might appear younger, more vulnerable. He dug deeper, searching for the social services report from the incident. That's when he hit the wall. The initial report was there, but the follow-up file, the one detailing the girl's placement and identity creation, was sealed. Restricted access. The official who signed off on the original intake report and the subsequent sealing of the file was the county's senior case manager at the time. Her name was Carol Gable. Finch leaned back in his chair, the pieces clicking into place with an ominous certainty. A girl disappears. A few days later, a traumatized Jane Doe of a roughly similar description appears 50 miles away. The case file is unusually thin and then sealed by a specific high-ranking social worker. The girl is given a new name and absorbed into the system. No public appeal is ever made. This wasn't a coincidence, and it wasn't a simple mistake. It was a cover-up. The only question was why. 2 days felt like an eternity to Jessica. She went through the motions at the diner, her body on autopilot, while her mind endlessly replayed the scene at the hospital. Every customer who walked in made her jump, half expecting to see Walter Peterson standing there with either an apology or an accusation. But there was only silence. The uncertainty was a physical ache, a knot of anxiety in her stomach that coffee couldn't dissolve. The silver locket never left her. She wore it on a simple chain tucked under her uniform. Its cool weight against her skin was a constant reminder, a solid piece of a past she was desperately trying to grasp. She had cleaned it, polishing away years of tarnish until the silver gleamed. The faces of the man and the woman with the baby were clearer now, a tiny, smiling family frozen in time. Her family. She knew she couldn't wait for Walter to come to her. His grief had made him blind and hostile. She had to force him to see. Armed with the locket and the information from Mrs. Davis about her suspiciously thin file, she made a decision. She was going back to the hospital. When she arrived, the air in the cardiac care unit waiting room was thick with a tense quiet. Walter was there looking even more haggarded than before. He stood when he saw her, his expression unreadable. It wasn't angry, but it wasn't welcoming either. It was the face of a man caught in a painful limbo. "You're back," he stated, his voice flat. "We need to talk," Jessica said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. She wouldn't be intimidated this time. "There's nothing to talk about," he began, but his protest was weak automatic. "Yes, there is," she insisted, taking a step closer. "There's this." She pulled the locket from under her shirt and held it out for him to see. "This was with me when I was found. It's been in a box my whole life." Walter's eyes fixed on the small, heart-shaped piece of silver. He didn't move, didn't reach for it. He just stared, his breath catching in his throat. "Please," Jessica implored, her voice softening. "Just look at it." As if in a trance, he reached out and took the locket. His thumb, rough and calloused, brushed over the dented surface. With a click, he opened it. He stared at the 2 tiny photographs inside, and a shudder ran through his entire body. His face, already a mask of exhaustion, seemed to crumble. This was my father's." He whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "He gave it to my wife Lauren on their first anniversary." He looked from the locket to Jessica, his eyes filled with a dawning, horrified understanding. Lauren died in a car accident when Jenny was 6. Jenny never took this locket off. It was the only thing she had of her mother's. The truth of his words hung between them, undeniable and devastating. This wasn't just a clue. It was a sacred artifact, a direct link between the daughter he had lost and the woman standing before him. His denial, his fortress, was breached beyond repair. How? He croaked, shaking his head. How is any of this possible? I don't know, Jessica admitted, but I know my file from social services was almost empty. There was no public appeal to find my family after the fire. It's like someone didn't want me to be found. The woman who handled my case was named Carol Gable. Before Walter could process this, a nurse gently entered the waiting area. Mr. Peterson, your mother is awake. She's weak, but she's asking for you. Relief and fear wore on Walter's face. He looked at Jessica, then at the nurse, then back to Jessica, his mind clearly struggling to reconcile the two realities, demanding his attention. Come with me, he said, the words surprising them both. It wasn't a request, it was a plea. Jessica's heart pounded as she followed him down the corridor to Brenda's room. The room was filled with the quiet hum and beep of monitors. Brenda Peterson lay in the bed looking smaller and more fragile than she had in the diner. Her eyes were closed, her face pale against the white pillowcase. An IV line snaked into her arm. She stirred as they entered, her eyelids fluttering open. Her gaze, cloudy at first, found her son. Walter? She breathed, her voice a dry rasp. I'm here, Mom, he said, rushing to her side and taking her hand. I'm right here. Brenda's eyes then moved past him and settled on Jessica, who stood hesitantly by the door. There was no shock. This time, no frantic desperation, just a quiet, profound recognition. A tear slipped from the corner of her eye and traced a path through her wrinkled skin. Jenny, she whispered the name of prayer. Walter, still clutching the locket, knelt beside his mother's bed. Mom, look, he said gently, opening the locket and holding it up for her to see. Look what she had. Brenda's eyes focused on the tiny photographs. A soft, sob-like sound escaped her lips. Robert and Lauren, she whispered, her gaze drifting back to Jessica. You kept it. You always kept it safe. She lifted a trembling hand, beckoning Jessica closer. Jessica moved to the other side of the bed, her own tears now flowing freely. She gently took the old woman's hand. It felt frail, but the grip was filled with a decade of longing. My sweet girl, Brenda murmured, her eyes searching Jessica's face. I'm so sorry. The fight, it was my fault. I was so afraid of losing you. Jessica had no memory of the fight, but she could feel the weight of this woman's guilt, the pain she had carried for 10 long years. It's okay, she whispered, squeezing her hand. I'm here now. At that moment, Walter's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting. It was Robert Finch. He excused himself, stepping out into the hallway to take the call. Walter. Finch's voice was grim. I found her. Carol Gable. She's living in a retirement community upstate. And I found the incident report, the fire at the Northwood warehouse. It matches the timeline. The Jane Doe from that fire is Jessica Morgan. But Walter, the report states the victim was a preteen, maybe 13 or 14, suffering from severe trauma and smoke-induced amnesia. The initial assessment was scribbled over. The age was changed to approx 4 to 5 years. It was a deliberate falsification. Walter leaned against the wall, the world spinning around him. Why? Why would she do that? I don't know yet, Finch said, but I'm driving up to see Mrs. Gable now. I have a feeling she's been waiting for this conversation for a very long time. Walter ended the call and looked back through the window into the hospital room. He saw Jessica leaning over his mother, gently wiping the tears from her cheek. The two women, grandmother and granddaughter, separated by a decade of lies and tragedy, were together. The sight broke through the last of his resistance, leaving him raw with guilt, regret, and a fragile, terrifying flicker of hope. He wasn't just looking at a waitress anymore. He was looking at his daughter. The Pleasant Vistas retirement community was anything but. It was a drab, beige building that smelled of disinfectant and boiled cabbage. Robert Finch found Carol Gable in a small, sun-bleached common room, staring blankly at a game show on a television whose colors were bled out and faded. She was a bird-like woman with sharp, anxious eyes that darted around the room as if expecting a predator. She looked less like a retired social worker and more like someone serving a life sentence. When Finch introduced himself and mentioned the name Jennifer Peterson, all the color drained from her face. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice thin and brittle. "That was a long time ago. My memory isn't what it used to be." Finch pulled up a chair, his movement slow and deliberate. He didn't loom or threaten. He simply sat, his presence filling the small space with an unshakable gravity. "My memory's just fine, Carol," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I remember a 14-year-old girl who vanished. I remember her parents who spent their life savings trying to find her. And I have an intake report from a warehouse fire with your signature on it where the victim's estimated age was mysteriously changed." He let the words hang in the air. Carol Gable visibly shrank into her chair. Her hands knotted with arthritis, twisted a tissue into shreds in her lap. "You don't understand," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the shredded tissue. "The system. It was a mess back then. We were underfunded, overwhelmed. Caseloads were impossible. Kids were falling through the cracks every single day." "So you gave one a push?" Finch asked, his voice hardening slightly. Tears welled in her sharp eyes. "No, it wasn't like that." She finally looked at him, her face a mask of ancient guilt. When she came in, the girl from the fire, she was a wreck, covered in soot, coughing, terrified. She couldn't remember her name, where she came from, anything. Total dissociative amnesia from the trauma. We put her in the hospital ward, ran some tests. We listed her as a Jane Doe approx, 13 to 14 years old. She took a shaky breath, her mind clearly back in that chaotic office from a decade ago. The next day, the Petersonen girl's missing person report came across my desk. The photo, it was her. I knew it was her. The resemblance was unmistakable. I was supposed to make the call, reunite the family. That was my job. "So what happened?" Carol Finch pressed gently. "Why didn't you?" This was the heart of it. The moment her life was diverted, a family left to drown in grief. "My supervisor," Carol said, her voice cracking. "Martin Cross. He was a monster, a bully who only cared about numbers, about closing cases to make himself look good. That same week, we'd had a horrible incident. A child we had placed back with his family against my recommendation ended up back in the hospital, badly beaten. The press was all over it. Cross was under investigation. His career was on the line. She wrung her hands, the story pouring out of her, now a confession she'd held in for 10 years. When I took the Petersonen file to him, he saw the photo. He knew we had her. But then he looked at her intake report, a runaway from an affluent family. He said it was a problem case. He said she ran away from them once. She'll do it again. They'll blame us if she gets hurt." He was terrified of another media circus, another black mark on his record. And then he looked at another file on his desk. A little girl, Jessica Morgan, 4 years old. She had died of pneumonia in one of our group homes 2 days earlier. But because of the chaos in the office, the paperwork hadn't been fully processed. Officially, she was still listed as an active case. Finch felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He could see where this was going. He saw an opportunity. Carol whispered, her face pale with the memory. A twisted, horrible solution. He said, "We have a missing girl no one can find and a dead girl no one is looking for. We can solve 2 problems." He told me to change the age on the Jane Doe report to say she was 4 or 5 to give her the dead girl's name. He said the amnesia was a gift. She had no past, so we could give her one. The Peterson case would go cold. The Jessica Morgan case would be closed, but she'd still be alive in the system. No messy reunion, no questions asked, just clean paperwork. And you went along with it. Finch's voice was laced with disbelief. "He threatened me," she cried, the tears flowing freely now. "He said he would pin the other case, the beaten boy, on me. He said he'd ruin my career, make sure I never worked with children again. I was a single mother. I was scared. I was a coward." She buried her face in her hand, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "So I did it. I falsified the report. I signed the papers. I created Jessica Morgan, and I have lived with it every single day since Martin Cross died of a heart attack 5 years ago. He got away with it, but I never did." The confession hung in the sterile air of the common room, ugly and tragic. It wasn't a story of a mustache-twirling villain, but of small, weak people making monstrous decisions under pressure. It was a story of bureaucratic convenience built on a foundation of human suffering. A girl's life, a family's heart traded for a clean file and a protected career. Finch sat there for a long time, the game show buzzing ignored in the background. He felt a profound sense of sorrow. He had spent years searching for a kidnapper, a predator, some dark external force that had stolen Jenny Peterson. But the truth was far more mundane and somehow far more sinister. She hadn't been stolen by a monster in the shadows. She had been erased by a man with a pen in a brightly lit office for the sake of a tidy report. He stood up, his purpose clear. "Thank you for your honesty, Carol," he said, his voice devoid of judgment. "You'll need to make a formal statement, of course, to the authorities, to the family." She nodded, not looking at him. "I know," she whispered to her lap. "It's time. It's long past time." As Finch walked out of Pleasant Vistas, he pulled out his phone. He had to make the most difficult call of his career. He had to call Walter Peterson and tell him that he had found his daughter and that she had been hidden in plain sight all along. The DNA test was a mere formality, a piece of paper confirming what their hearts already knew. Jessica Morgan was without a doubt Jennifer Peterson. The news didn't bring a sudden cinematic burst of joy, but a quiet, profound gravity that settled over them all. Spurred by a hope more potent than any medicine, Brenda's recovery was swift. Within a week, she was home, not in her own quiet house, but in Walter's with the granddaughter she thought she'd lost forever. Walking into the Petersonen house was like stepping into a beautiful haunted museum of a life she couldn't recall. Photos of a smiling girl with her face were everywhere, a constant reminder of the ghost she was supposed to be. The reunion was not a simple fairy tale ending. It was messy and achingly real. Brenda was overcome with pure joy, holding Jennifer's hand for hours, trying to stitch back the lost years with stories. For Walter, every moment was tinged with a deep, crushing guilt for his disbelief and the harsh words that had driven his daughter away a decade ago. For the woman at the center of it all, it was a dizzying navigation of a fractured identity. The name Jennifer felt like a costume. These loving people were still strangers. She was Jessica, the quiet waitress, who sketched on napkins and dreamed of a future. Not Jennifer, the girl from a past she couldn't access. The breakthrough came one afternoon in the attic. Walter pulled a dusty sheet off a stack of old canvases, revealing paintings full of vibrant emotional color. They were Jenny's work from her teenage years. Jess stared, not remembering the act of painting them, but recognizing the style, the bold brush strokes, the blend of colors as intrinsically her own. The artist had survived when the memories had not. "You always wanted to go to art school," Walter said, his voice thick with regret. "That's what our fight was about. I told you to be realistic. I was a fool. In that dusty attic, a bridge formed between the ghost of Jennifer Peterson and the reality of Jessica Morgan. They were one and the same." She began to ask them to call her Jess, a name that felt like a quiet treaty between her two lives. The following months were a slow, tentative process of becoming a family. The scandal of her disappearance and the subsequent cover-up faded into yesterday's news. What remained was the day-to-day work of building new memories. Jess enrolled in an art class, the feel of a real paintbrush, a comfort in her hand. There were still moments of awkward silence and the heavy weight of the lost years, but they were increasingly replaced by shared meals, inside jokes, and tentative laughter. One evening, months later, Jess stood in her old room, looking at her reflection in the mirror. She saw her grandfather's hazel green eyes, her father's stubborn chin, and a strength that was entirely her own. For the first time, the face staring back wasn't a stranger. It wasn't just Jessica the orphan or Jennifer the ghost. It was Jess, a mosaic of all she had lost and all she had found. And finally, she was home. What an unbelievable story of loss, identity, and the unbreakable bonds of family. For 10 years, a family grieved for a daughter they believed was gone forever. While that same daughter lived another life just miles away, her past erased by a terrible secret. Jessica and the Peterson family's journey is a powerful reminder that hope can survive in the darkest of places, and that the truth, no matter how long it's buried, will always find its way to the light. Their path forward won't be easy. Rebuilding a life and a family after a decade of absence is a challenge filled with both pain and incredible joy. If this story of resilience and reunion moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button. What part of their story shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to share this incredible story with others who might be inspired by it. To make sure you don't miss our next real-life drama, hit subscribe and ring the notification bell. Thank you for listening.